Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving deep into a document that, I mean, it sounds like something pulled straight out of a history vault, maybe gathering dust on a shelf somewhere.
It really does.
The U.S. Marine Corps Small Wars Manual. And it was first published way back in 1940.
And you see that date, 1940, and you immediately think, well, artifact. It's from a bygone era. But the central curiosity and really the absolute core of our discussion today is that it just refuses to become obsolete.
That's the crazy part. I mean, think about that timeline. It was drafted just before the United States enters World War II, the biggest conventional war in history.
Right, and it was based on conflicts from the early 20th century. We're talking about wars fought with, horses and really rudimentary aviation.
So the question we have to answer is why? Why is this 1940 manual still considered foundational doctrine? Why was it, of all things, recommended reading for troops headed into the complexities of the Iraq War in the 21st century?
Well, the fact that our sources call it a classic of military science, that tells you a lot.
It tells you everything, really. This isn't just some old book for historians to study. It's a living piece of doctrine. It informs modern military actions, which is just, it's kind of mind-blowing.
It is. We're talking about a pre-digital, pre-nuclear guide that somehow managed to anticipate the challenges of modern counterinsurgency.
So our mission in this deep dive is to basically give you, the listener, a shortcut right to the core of that relevance.
Exactly. The Small Wars Manual, or SWM as we'll probably call it, it outlines tactics and strategies for operations short of war proper.
Or small wars.
Small wars. So we're going to trace its genesis, the actual messy, boots-on-the-ground experiences that shaped it, and then we'll break down its structure, which is surprisingly comprehensive.
And that's where you see the lessons that, conventional warfare manuals just completely ignore.
They don't even touch on them.
Because what you learn from this deep dive is that these operations from the early 1900s, they weren't just footnotes in history. They were the practical laboratories that forged how the U.S. approaches stability operations, occupation, and counterinsurgency even today.
And it was the unique character of the Marine Corps at that time that created the perfect storm, really, for this doctrine to be born.
Okay, so let's start there. To really get the SWM, you have to understand the historical role of the Marine Corps in the early 20th century.
Absolutely. For about 4 decades leading up to World War II, the Corps was not primarily getting ready for these massive amphibious assaults we associate with the Pacific.
Right, like Tarawa or Iwo Jima.
Exactly. Instead, it was functioning, for all intents and purposes, as the nation's overseas police force. It was the go-to initial response for political crises abroad.
That is such a crucial distinction. Because when you look at the political landscape then, especially in the Western Hemisphere.
Central America, the Caribbean.
Right. If the U.S. government needed to project influence quickly, or maybe intervene to protect its interests, or stabilize a chaotic situation, the Marines were the ones who got the call.
They were the organization that was most available and, more importantly, structured to do those kinds of missions. They were the tip of the spear, but for these low-intensity, highly political actions.
So this wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't just a matter of convenience.
Oh, not at all. The sources are pretty clear on this. They say this role was a natural adjunct of the Corps' official mission,
which was sea-based power projection. So let's unpack that. Why was it a natural fit? I mean, why the Marines and not, say, the Army, especially if you're talking about long-term stabilization?
It really boils down to 3 things. Their institutional identity, their structure, and just practical readiness.
Okay.
So first, their whole reason for being was projecting power from the sea. That naturally positions them to be the first responders on foreign coastlines. You don't need an established airfield. You don't need complex basing agreements. You can just operate right off the ship.
So their logistical tail, at least initially, was really small. They could essentially live off the sea for a while.
Precisely. Their fundamental character was, and still is, expeditionary. They're built to operate far from home with a small footprint and a high degree of self-sufficiency.
Which is a world away from how large Army formations worked back then.
A world away. The Army needed massive, pre-positioned logistical support, transportation. It was a much bigger, slower machine to get moving.
And you mentioned a third reason, a more pragmatic one in the sources. Availability.
Yes. The operational mechanisms, even the legal permissions to deploy the Marines, were often just simpler and faster. They were always ready, always available for a sudden and immediate call.
So they filled that gap, that operational space between just doing diplomacy and declaring an all-out war.
Exactly. They were the perfect instrument for missions that were crucially short of war proper.
Which brings us directly to the crucible of experience. The need for this manual, it wasn't born in a classroom or at a war college.
Not at all. It was driven by decades of dirty, difficult, real-world fighting across a pretty small geographic area.
And this is the absolute core of the SWM's legacy, isn't it? It's based on intense, concentrated experience, not abstract theory.
That is the line to remember. Based upon experience, not theory. The doctrine came out of this roughly 40-year period from the late 1890s to the early 1930s that was just packed with these guerrilla wars and military interventions.
All across Central America and the Caribbean.
Right. And we know these conflicts by a collective name that's maybe a bit simplistic today, but it's instantly memorable.
The Banana Wars.
The Banana Wars. These interventions in places like Nicaragua, Haiti, the Dominican Republic, they were the proving grounds.
And the sources really emphasize this. These conflicts gave the practical, non-theoretical basis for how the Marines learned to fight in these really complex, population-centric environments.
Yeah, the enemies weren't conventional armies in neat uniforms on a battlefield. They were insurgents, bandits, local militias, all blending seamlessly into the civilian population.
That must have been a huge shock for a military force trained in the tactics of the time. You know, you're not fighting for a clear front line or some strategic hill in the way you would in a European war.
Not at all. You're involved in population control, counter-guerrilla operations, training local security forces. It required a completely different operational mindset, a different ethical one even.
And they had to learn it all by doing it, by trial and error, often in these awful conditions in mountains and jungles.
The terrain itself dictated the tactics. You had these small, isolated detachments moving through difficult country, facing ambushes, not pitched battles.
And the logistics. I can't even imagine moving supplies, getting wounded soldiers out all across roadless areas, probably relying on pack mules.
Or just carrying everything on their backs. The sheer density of these operations in that specific period meant the institutional learning curve was incredibly steep. They were constantly deploying, withdrawing, intervening, and this is the key part, analyzing the results in painstaking detail.
So it created this intense feedback loop. That process is what created the institutional knowledge that would eventually become the SWM.
That's it. So you have all this raw experience piling up, intervention after intervention. The question is, how does the Marine Corps take all that messy, specific, real-world data and turn it into one cohesive, enduring classic?
This is where the systematic analysis comes in. They didn't just write down war stories.
No, they applied a really profound systematic analysis. They recognized that even though these small wars were in different places, Haiti, Nicaragua, wherever, they shared common characteristics, common requirements.
They realized they couldn't just use the existing manuals for large-scale war.
Those manuals didn't cover governance or counterinsurgency at all. So the crucial insight, and our sources repeat this over and over, is that the SWM is based upon experience, not theory. They built the theory after the fact, using detailed field reports and after-action summaries as the raw material.
And that distinction is so vital. It gives the SWM a practicality, it's a kind of lived-in feel that so much military doctrine just lacks. It's written by people who are actually there.
Exactly. Not by staff officers staring at maps in an office. And we can actually trace the building blocks of the manual. The sources highlight two key early reports that really cemented this approach.
Okay, the first one's from 1921, a formal report by a Major Samuel M. Harrington, and it was titled The Strategy and Tactics of Small Wars.
Just the title alone tells you so much.
It does. They were already recognizing this type of conflict as its own unique category. It needed its own way of thinking.
It was the first real attempt to group all these disparate actions under a single operational umbrella. And then, 2 years later, in 1923, you get what I think is the perfect example of this deep dive approach.
This is the one from Major C.J. Miller.
Right. And this was not some philosophical treatise. It was a mammoth 154-page deep dive into the 2nd Marine Brigade's operations in the Dominican Republic.
Wait, 154 pages, just on one brigade's operations in one country.
154 pages.
That shows just a meticulous, almost scientific commitment to detail. What on earth do you put in 154 pages?
Everything. That's why it's so important. Not just the combat details like rules of engagement they developed for dealing with local militias or tactics for defending supply routes.
Well, the non-combat stuff, too.
All of it.
Yeah.
How to work with local police, how to manage the treasury, even specific requirements for medical services and sanitation in these, primitive environments. That level of detail is how you bake lessons into an institution's memory.
And the title of that report is just perfect. Diplomacy and Spurs in the Dominican Republic. That phrase, diplomacy and spurs.
It captures the whole contradiction, doesn't it?
It really does. You needed the military force, the spurs, to create security, but you also needed political finesse and engagement, the diplomacy, to actually achieve the long-term goal.
It perfectly captures the operational reality. It's this acknowledgement that in a small war, you're not just a fighting force. You are also a diplomat, a governor, a police officer, often all at the same time.
So the reports from guys like Miller are the real nuts and bolts. They're about dealing with land disputes, vetting local security guys, setting up a civil administration.
All of it. The doctrine had to cover how to secure a town square and how to help organize a provisional court system.
It sounds like they really understood the difference between winning a firefight and, winning the peace.
They absolutely did.
But I do have a question here. If they were relying so heavily on these very specific experiences in Central America, wasn't there a risk of developing a doctrine that was too narrow, that couldn't scale to a new conflict?
That's a really perceptive question, and I think the answer is in how they managed the process. The Marine Corps realized that while the specific names and places changed, the categories of problems were constant.
Okay.
You always need logistics for a small force. You always face insurgents who blend in with the population. You always need a post-conflict plan for governance.
So they abstracted the common principles.
Exactly. Principles like the absolute necessity of integrating civil affairs into the military plan from day one. That proved to be universal, even if some of the tactics, like using mounted detachments, became dated over time.
And these reports weren't just filed away in a cabinet somewhere.
No, this was an active, ongoing debate across the entire force. These findings, this institutional knowledge, it started appearing in serialized versions in prominent professional publications.
So places like the Marine Corps Gazette and the Proceedings of the U.S. Naval Institute.
Right, so the concepts were being tested, criticized, and refined by the wider military community. Marine officers, Navy officers, others could all weigh in with their own experiences.
So it was a robust intellectual process. It wasn't just some top-down mandate. It was a bottom-up, experience-validated consensus that was being built.
It was, and that leads us to the publication timeline. There were two distinct stages.
The first encapsulation of all this comes out in 1935. It was titled Small Wars Operations. So that's kind of the rough draft of the classic.
It is. And then the definitive version, the one we still talk about today, follows 5 years later in 1940. It's revised, and it gets renamed the Small Wars Manual, the SWM.
The timing is just incredible. 1940, the U.S. is on the verge of entering this massive global conventional war, World War II.
And yet, the Marine Corps, in this moment of just deep strategic foresight, they pause to formalize the crucial difference between fighting that kind of war and fighting these smaller, irregular, population-centric conflicts.
They cemented this doctrine right before their focus shifted entirely to the Pacific theater. It's amazing.
It is.
So let's fast forward. Decades pass. The manual is on the shelves. The Cold War happens. Doctrine shifts to massive tank battles in Europe or proxy wars. The world changes dramatically. So why does this 1940 manual suddenly become required reading for a new generation?
And that brings us to the relevance check, and the connection is General James Mattis.
Right. When the Corps was preparing to go back into Iraq in the mid-2000s, and not for the invasion, but for that long, painful period as an occupation and counterinsurgency force, that's the key distinction.
It is. General Mattis encouraged the troops of the 1st Marine Division to read the SWM. He recognized that the challenges they were about to face had way more in common with 1920s Nicaragua than with Desert Storm.
That is just such a powerful endorsement. It shows its continued standing as the foundation of much current thinking and doctrine. When a modern general like Mattis points his troops back to a pre-WWII manual.
You know, it contains something timeless, these non-tactical principles of governance and stability that large-scale war doctrine just completely ignores.
To really get why, we need to look at the manual structure, the actual chapter list, because that's where you see the comprehensive and honestly non-traditional scope of what a small war really is.
When you look at those chapter titles, it becomes immediately clear that this involves so much more than just fighting. This is not a guide on how to shoot straight. It's a blueprint for how to rebuild a functioning society in a hostile, unstable place.
Okay, so let's break it down. It starts with the basics, the core military and logistics chapters.
Right, the functional requirements for any operation. But they're already tailored for a small expeditionary footprint.
Chapter 1 is the introduction.
It just establishes the core concept. What is a small war? How is it different? Chapter 2 is organization, how to set up an ad hoc, self-sufficient structure in a foreign country.
And Chapter 3 is logistics. This is where you can already see the difference. Standard Army logistics is about mass movement. Small Wars logistics, from the Banana Wars, had to be about efficiency, local sourcing.
And just surviving without immediate resupply across brutal terrain, they needed to know how to sustain a force when your supply line is a pack mule train that's getting ambushed constantly.
Not a secured highway.
Exactly. Chapter 4 is training. And this is critical. Training for a small war isn't just marksmanship. It's about restraint, understanding cultural norms, learning basic phrases.
Recognizing that every single interaction you have with a civilian is a strategic event.
Yes. And Chapter 5 is initial operations, the crucial first steps, securing a port, government buildings, establishing that initial foothold.
So that's the essential military framework. But then the manual pivots, and it dedicates a huge amount of space to the tactical operations that reflect the irregular nature of the fights in Central America.
Right. Chapter 6 through X are all about fighting guerrillas and bandits, not conventional armies. The front line is everywhere.
Chapter 6 is on infantry patrols.
In a small war, patrols are everything. They're about security, presence, demonstrating control. They aren't just for recon.
Then Chapter 7, mounted detachments. This sounds so archaic. Why horses in 1940?
Well, it speaks directly to the geography of the time. In areas with no roads for vehicles, horses were essential for mobility, for reconnaissance, for responding quickly to raids.
So the principle is timeless. Even if the technology, the horse has changed, it's about mobility across rough terrain.
That's it. It's the same problem you face in Afghanistan, just with different tools. Then Chapter 8 is convoys and convoy escorts. That's a daily life or death mission when you're facing IEDs or ambushes.
And the SWM gives specific, detailed tactics for that.
It does. Then you get Chapter 9's aviation, which is fascinating for a 1940 manual. It shows they already understood the value of air power for reconnaissance and transport in these kinds of fights.
And Chapter X is river operations. Again, highly specific to the geography of Central America, where rivers were key transport arteries that had to be controlled.
It shows how adaptable the doctrine had to be. But now we get to the real aha moment for the modern reader.
This is the pivot, the chapters on governance and civil affairs. This is what separates the SWM from a typical field manual.
This is its enduring core. It's the fundamental acknowledgement that winning the combat phase is only the beginning. The real goal is political stability.
They realized that if they didn't succeed in civil affairs, the insurgents would just come back the minute the troops left.
Absolutely. So let's look at these last 5 chapters. Chapter 11 is disarmament of population.
A huge, critical post-conflict task. How do you get weapons out of the hands of former combatants without causing more conflict?
It's incredibly complex. And if you're seen as being unfair, taking weapons from one group but not another, you've just lost the political battle right there.
Yeah.
Then Chapter 12, armed native organizations. This is about dealing with local security forces or militias who might be your allies one day and your problem the next.
It's the classic double-edged sword. You need them, but you can't always trust them. The SWM forces you to think about that strategically.
Then you get to Chapter 13, military government.
This is the big one.
Yeah.
This is the recognition that when the local government collapses, the military has to step in and run things. Temporarily.
Everything. Infrastructure, policing, public finances, a provisional judicial system. You become the mayor.
And you can see why Matt has pointed to this. This was the playbook for the power vacuum after Saddam Hussein. The principles of establishing legitimacy and basic services were identical to what Marines faced in Haiti 80 years earlier.
And the manual is clear. The goal is always to create the conditions for local governance to succeed so you can leave.
Which leads to maybe the most surprising chapter of all. Chapter 14. Supervision of elections.
It's the pinnacle of non-combat duty, isn't it? The military's role becomes ensuring fairness and security in a highly charged political process. You're securing polling stations, preventing intimidation.
It's such a powerful illustration that the end goal of a small war is political, not just tactical. If the population doesn't believe the election was free and fair, the whole intervention fails.
Legitimacy flows from political consensus, not just from the barrel of a gun. And finally, Chapter 15, withdrawal.
Even leaving is a planned operation.
It recognizes that if you mess up the departure, leave a vacuum, leave the new government vulnerable, the whole country can slide right back into chaos. You have to plan the exit with as much care as the entry.
So that whole chapter list, It's a holistic blueprint. It moves seamlessly from organizing machine gun crews to overseeing a democratic process.
And that's why Mattis turned to it for Iraq. It provided a framework for stabilizing a chaotic environment by acknowledging that success meant tackling political and civil disorder with the same rigor as you tackle tactical threats.
So if we synthesize all this, the enduring power of the SWM isn't its specific tactical advice about, mounted detachment.
No, that's obsolete.
Its power is its conceptual breadth. It mandates that anyone undertaking one of these small wars has to be prepared for the full spectrum of intervention, from fighting guerrillas to administering justice to organizing a clean exit.
It's the institutionalization of the idea that in these conflicts, the fight is often secondary to the political and civic effort. It's a document born from the hard lesson that military force was only the lever to apply the political pressure needed for lasting stability.
So our deep dive really reveals that the Small Wars Manual stays relevant not because the technology is the same, but because the foundational human problems it addresses, well, they just haven't changed.
Exactly. The key takeaway is that the SWM is this highly distilled document on the incredible complexities of military intervention. It's a field guide for population-centric warfare forged in the furnace of the Banana Wars. Pure practice, translated into doctrine.
And this leads us to a really fascinating, provocative thought for you, the listener, to chew on. Our sources mention that the SWM, for all its fame about being built on experience, it exists within a larger body of military work on this very topic.
Right. Specifically, it was preceded by the hugely influential work of a British colonel, Sir Charles Edward Caldwell. His book was called Small Wars, Their Principles and Practice, and it was published way earlier, around 1906.
So Caldwell had already laid out a lot of the intellectual and theoretical groundwork based on British colonial experiences.
He had. So if the Marine Corps doctrine was so famously built on experience and they insisted it was not theory, it raises a really important question for you to explore.
How much did the practical, boots-on-the-ground analysis of the Banana Wars, that highly specific knowledge that became the SWM, how much did it diverge from, or maybe unconsciously incorporate, the theoretical framework that Caldwell had already laid out?
Did Harrington and Miller just use Caldwell's categories like governance or logistics as a kind of bucket list to organize their own raw data? Or did they genuinely invent a whole new doctrine from scratch?
Connecting that practical Marine Corps experience with the broader theoretical influences of global military history, it adds a final crucial layer of depth to understanding this essential manual.